Hello, in this video I'm going to review the Su-122A, the Soviet Tier 5 self-propelled gun. Coming after the Su-5, which I really enjoyed, the Su-122A is a very different beast. But given a bit of time to adjust, I actually really came to enjoy playing it. Normally I'd begin a review by talking about the history of the vehicle in question, but in this case there isn't actually much to say. The Su-122A was a proposal to put a 122mm gun on the Su-76 chassis. And that is all the information I've been able to find out about this design. To be honest, this is going to be a common theme moving up the Soviet artillery line. In my review of the Su-5, I talked about how Stalin's purges held back Soviet SPG design. Basically, there was a XXX axis SPG proposal or program back in the late 1930s, but some of the designers of those SPGs were caught up in the purges, and only the Su-5 of those designs entered service, and development of Soviet SPG stalled after that. It only really got started again in 1942 and 1943 with the Su-76 and Su-122. And also the Soviets only really produced direct-fire SPGs. They chose to focus on tank destroyers and assault guns with some indirect fire capability, as opposed to more purpose-built indirect fire artillery. In fact, in World of Tanks, none of the Soviet SPGs above Tier 4 actually made it past the prototype stage. In World of Tanks, the Su-122A is quite different from the Su-5 at Tier 4. While the Su-5 has a very powerful but short-range mortar, the Su-122A gets a lot longer range than the Su-5, but it loses the high firing arc of the mortar. The Su-5 has a gun elevation of 72 degrees, allowing it to easily fire over obstacles and hit enemies who think they are safe. However, the Su-122A only gets 45 degrees as its maximum elevation. This means that the tactics used in the Su-122A are very different from the Su-5. Having said that, the Su-122A does get two very good guns. The stock gun is only 122mm, but it does the same damage as the top gun of the Su-5, and only has slightly less penetration. This can be upgraded to a 152mm howitzer, which gets 910 average damage with high explosive, and improved penetration over the 122mm shells. However, the rate of fire of this gun does decrease, but all the other stats stay roughly the same between the stock gun and the upgraded gun. The other big change you'll notice coming from the Su-5 is the increase in ammunition. You only get 15 rounds with a 152mm gun, but this makes running out of shells a lot less likely and gives you a few more chances to hit enemies. In fact, I never got a Fadens medal in the Su-122A, whereas I got quite a few of them in the Su-5. The mobility of the Su-122A is actually fairly good. Top speed of 30 km an hour is not fantastic, but sufficient to relocate for artillery. The traverse of 26 degrees per second is also fairly good for an SPG. The gun traverse arc has also increased since the Su-5, so you won't have to turn quite as often, but it's still not great, so you will have to turn pretty often. I played 164 games in the Su-122A. I won 55% of them, despite only killing 0.91 enemies per battle. These stats are a decline from the Su-5, although only a slight one, and they largely have to do with the poor gun elevation of the Su-122A. I was very accurate in the Su-5, landing about 1 in 3 shots. However, in the Su-122A, this dropped to about 1 in 4. I think the reason for this is that in the Su-5 I was much closer to the enemy, meaning that there was a fairly short shell travel time, and the high elevation of the gun gave me the ability to hit stationary enemies behind cover. In the Su-122A, I simply couldn't get close to enemies. The poor elevation of the gun meant that I struggled to fire over rocks, so I kind of relied on distance to keep me safe as opposed to hard cover. I couldn't hit enemies behind cover as often, so I had to take more shots at enemies moving between cover, which bit less likely to hit. It's also important to note that although the damage of the high explosive shells are huge, or is huge, this increase does not really flow onto heavily armoured tanks. The Su-5 tended to lob shells onto the poorly armoured roofs of tanks, while the Su-122A, because it has a flatter shell trajectory, tends to hit the side of tanks, which is usually more heavily armoured. These differences mean that the spots you learned in the Su-5 are no longer useful in the Su-122A. Instead, you are looking for positions where you will not be spotted, but you will be able to fire into an area where tanks usually congregate. You are especially looking for spots where you can fire into the flanks of enemy heavy tanks, since this is the only way that you will really be able to do significant damage to them. In the late game, relocating becomes more important as you try to find angles to force enemies out of cover or hit campers, but that's only really useful if the game's turning into a stalemate, which probably only happens maybe one game in 10. But despite the limitations of the Su-122A in terms of gun elevation, and actually I suppose that's the real big limitation, is that the gun's got poor elevation, there is one very good thing about this tank, and that is that, well, your shells do 1,000 damage if they hit and penetrate, or near enough to it, and there is no tank at tier 5 with that many hit points. So you one-shot a lot of enemies, and it is great every time. And it more than makes up for the limitations of this tank, the ability to just destroy enemies. And you see here, I've kind of got a good opportunity right now. There's a KV-4 moving up to attack one of my allied tanks, and while it's doing this, it's actually giving me its rear, which, as you'll know, is very thin armour, so I'm very likely to actually penetrate. It's giving me the side now, and there's the rear. I take the shot, 444 damage. Didn't quite kill it, but still doing 444 damage to an enemy heavy tank is still pretty satisfying. And this game's basically run out now. Just kind of waiting for the last 2 enemy tanks left, this M7 medium here, and there's an enemy artillery somewhere. So I was kind of aiming where I thought the M7 would go, but it stops, so I aim on it. It takes a fairly long time to aim in the Su-122A, but I shoot before I'm fully aimed because I think it's about to die, but turns out it wasn't. And unfortunately, it survives just long enough to think that I might get a second chance of killing this guy. Oh, no. My allies killed it. But oh well. It's artillery left, somewhere. And I'm looking at where my team is, and I'm thinking that artillery must be up in kind of the northwestern corner of the map somewhere. I was thinking these trees here is a fairly likely spot. I'm looking around, seeing if anything's knocked over, because I was kind of keen to just lob a shell into somewhere where it might be. But I don't see any signs of it in here. My team's moving in pretty quickly, so I'll just wait to see if they can spot it for me. It's obviously not on this. Oh, it's up on the hill there. And it's going to die, but we've also captured the base, so that's a pretty solid win there. This game's on Pearl River, and I think this is actually the most kills I ever got in a game in my Su-122A. As I said, I didn't actually get very many kills per game. I got on average less than 1 kill per game, and that's largely because there were quite a few games where I just didn't hit anything, or I'd get 1 or 2 shells on target and I'd do 400 damage and no kills. But every once in a while you get a game where things just turned out well, your shells were on target, you did your damage, everything was great. So I'm aiming here at the centre of the map, kind of expecting that A43 will spot somebody as they come around the corner. But nobody's come yet. And Stuart's gone up and spotted a Sherman in the middle of the field. But And I start aiming at that, and then of course the T1 heavy shows up right where I was aiming before. So switch back to the T1. I'm almost aimed. And I think that's about good enough. And it's dead. So, enemy heavy tank destroyed. And now my team's going to push around the corner here, so I shift back and start aiming kind of near these trees, because I'm kind of expecting tank destroyers to get spotted as my team push forward in the centre here. But nothing's happening, so I switch my fire down to the south, where there are plenty of enemy heavy tanks spotted. I have the side of a KV-1 here. It's disappeared, but I'm hoping one of those ELCs will spot it again. And there it is. It's pushing pretty aggressively. And I've lost the flank, but it stops. So I take a shot. Oh, I just missed, but I managed to track it. It repairs its tracks and moves on, which means I don't get anything from it, but whatever. Got to use its repair kit. Spotted a Nashorn, and I've actually got a very thin shot at this over the rock and into its, must be the upper superstructure, but I decide to take it. I wasn't expecting that to hit, but as you see I managed to kill the Nashorn there. A KV-2, and I'm kind of aiming here because I want to hit the turret of the KV-2 because I know it's got fairly thin armour, unless I'm unfortunate enough to hit the gun directly. So I'm kind of trying to keep aiming for the turret. I'm trying to aim for the far side of the turret in the hope that I will hit the near side. And the shot goes in. Well, it worked out for me. Only 252 damage, but I killed a tier 6 heavy tank. And our forces on this side have actually been surrounded and now being attacked by the rear. Which is bad for them, but it's good for me because it gives me the rear of this enemy KV-1, which, as you saw in the last battle, I can do a fair bit of damage if given the rear of a heavy tank. Aim, fire. Ah, okay, only 188 damage. Obviously the tracks absorbed some of that, but while I've tracked it, my enemies kill it, and my allies kill it, so I would have got some more experience and credits from that. So only 4 enemy tanks left now. I've killed 3 of the, other enemies. And these 4 are all camping. I'm just kind of waiting for my team to push up so I can lob some shells into them. And I'm thinking they'll be in around these houses, mainly because that's where they were last spotted. And there's a gorilla, but I'm not going to get a shot on that because my team kill it very quickly, as you would expect. Come on, enemy tanks, where are you? Thinking maybe they're back at the rear of the cap. And there's a KV-85, and again I've got a very thin shot at this between the 2 buildings, but I take it in a second. And again it works out well for me, and again not a lot of damage, but killed a tier 6 heavy tank. There's only 2 left now, the Wolverine and the Hellcat, and well, they're both pretty good targets to shoot at because they don't have a lot of armour, and in fact they've both got open turrets so I can easily one-shot them, but I'm just not going to get the opportunity to. My gun reloads and I take a shot at the Hellcat, but it's dead well before my shell arrives, and my shell misses anyway. But still 4 kills, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Especially since, as I said, I tend to run about 25% accuracy in this thing. So things went well for me that time. In this game I'm taking up, well, it's a position I don't really take that often in my artillery, but I like to come over here because I get behind the depressions and it just gives me kind of good angles into the centre here. Well, to kill the heavy tanks that come into the centre. Actually, is this map still in the rotation? I don't think it is, at least I haven't seen it for a while. But anyway, we spotted T1 Heavy, and it's given me its rear flank I don't know why, because it's also presenting its side to my ally tanks, but I'm okay with that. It starts moving, so I decide not to take the shot. Didn't want to waste this shell, and instead aiming at this T-14, but it moves behind cover. And this Churchill, is it no? I aim, and I manage to one-shot a Tier 5 heavy tank. So that Churchill's obviously didn't have a good game, but I'm having a good time. It's always fun when you one-shot a heavy tank. And here comes a KV-1. It gets tracked, so it gives me a good opportunity to aim in it, and gives me time to reload, because I am fully aimed. Just got to wait for the shell to get into the breach. And there it goes. And that's 2 enemy heavy tanks destroyed. So, I'm pretty happy right now. It's a 3001p there. Oh, it gets shot by one of my allied artillery. Let me spot that T1 heavy from earlier. And I figure this is I don't know what he's doing. It's got the rock on the wrong side of it. But, whatever, I take the shot. 369 damage, doesn't quite kill it. But, still. Now it's dead. And as you can see, my team's basically swarmed up the western flank of the map, where there are now 2 enemy tank destroyers, which I'm going to provide support against. But on the east and in the centre, I think in the centre both teams have basically wiped each other out. But on the the east, the enemy team has 1 and is now swarming around. Took a shot at that Hellcat there, but it was dead before my shell arrived. And instead, I'm now going to try and delay the enemy as much as I can in the east, so that our team has the chance to get on the cap and win the game through capping, because basically that's the only way it's going to happen this game. Another enemy heavy tank, T150, and it stops, it disappears, but I take a shot and I miss. It happens quite a bit actually. There's that 3001p from earlier. And unfortunately I'm still reloading, and it starts moving well before I'm reloaded, so in retrospect I probably shouldn't have fired at the T150, because I probably could have killed this 3001p right now. But instead I have to take a very dubious shot, and then I wasn't really paying attention. I start pulling back, and I forgot there was a stream behind me, and I actually can't get out now. So this is kind of an embarrassing way to end the game. But as you see, our team is well and truly in the cap. We are very much ahead. Enemies also capping, but they're not going to catch up. Here's an enemy heavy tank coming for me. And I'm finally kind of almost able to get out. No, I'm out. But T150 kills me. Which is fair enough. Anyway, that's the SU-122A. So see, it's got its limitations, but just being able to put out that kind of damage to enemy tanks more than makes up for it. I hope you've enjoyed this review or found it interesting or informative, and I'll see you all next time.